Hey everyone, Christopher Ruocchio here, author of the Sun Eater science fantasy series from Dog Books and 6-year veteran of the publishing industry. And today I wanted to do something a little bit different and address a question that a lot of you have asked sort of around in the last several weeks, both in the comments here and on places like Facebook or Discord. And that question is, how exactly do authors get paid? How do I make money? And I know that's kind of a prying question, so I figured I would just go ahead and answer it so that folks don't have to feel so uncomfortable. Because I know when I was a reader, this was something I wondered about a lot because, of course, I wanted to do this for a job. And I know I had a lot of misconceptions about how things work. And while I recognize that many of you watching may have some idea about how the publishing industry functions, things like advances and contracts, going ahead and talking about it seemed like the thing to do. And as a way of jumping in, I would like to start with a bit of a misconception that folks have. And this is going to sound strange, but that misconception is that publishing pays writers. Now, that is technically true, right? My checks have my publisher's name on them, but it's not functionally true in sort of an economic sense, because what publishers do when you sign a contract with them is they, one of the many things that contract stipulates is that they will be paying you an advance, right? And now that is an advance against royalties. And royalty is the amount of money that you make per sale, right? Per book, per ebook, per audiobook, whatever. And it is those royalties that are really the income you're making as a writer. The advance they give you up front, be that $10,000, $5,000, $0, or $1 million, is not really the amount of money that you're worth, right? You may be worth more, depending, or you may be worth less. Rather, your book may be worth less. You, of course, being a person, are priceless. You know how it is. But in sort of an economic sense, the product that you've produced, your book, is going to be worth a certain amount, and that's the amount of money that it earns, right? And now it sucks to talk about people's art and their passion as a business, but the reality is that everybody needs to eat. So let's get that out of the way for a minute. We are going to be talking about money. I know there are a lot of people, particularly in sort of artistic-minded circles, who find that speaking about money is deeply vulgar and upsetting, and I understand that, right? But at the same time, these are things that if you want to be a writer, particularly a traditionally published writer, we should talk about. Your book is going to be worth the amount of money it earns. It's worth the amount of copies that it sells. Now, obviously, right, there are things that publishers can do, that booksellers can do to make sure it sells more, right? They can promote it better or differently. And so I understand the problems talking about a book's value being related purely to how many copies it sells, because obviously the best book in the world may have never been read. Again, there's value in sort of an absolute sense, and there's value economically. And if you're running a business, which publishers are businesses, they need to be looking at that economic value. So when they pay you in advance, what they are doing is they are treating you like a square on a roulette wheel, and they're putting their money down on you. Now, that amount of that upfront money may vary, but you will only ever get, as a writer, either what you are worth or more than you're worth, right? Because very, very, very rarely these days do those contracts stipulate the advance money needs to be returned if it's not earned out, right? All the contracts that I've signed for various publishers have been like, here's your money, right? That's for the work you did. And that's to keep your lights on while you wait for those sales to happen. Because obviously, if you did not pay writers until their books sold, then you wouldn't see money for 6 months or a year or 18 months, because usually those royalty checks accounts get credited and added up and paid out every 6 months. So you usually get 2 royalty payouts a year, right? And that is a very hard way to live, right? Most salary positions, you're getting paid monthly or twice monthly or weekly, right? And that's a lot easier to make, your grocery payments, right? And keep the lights on than getting paid all at once. Because one of the big potholes that new writers fall into in the same way that lottery winners do is they'll get 50 grand up front and they'll go try to buy a house and they'll forget about taxes, right? Which is not great. They give you an advance up front, right? Let's say it's $10,000, right? And let's say that your contract stipulates that you get 10% royalties and the sticker price for your hardcover is $20, right? That means you're getting $2 a book. That means you need to sell 5,000 hardcover copies to make up the $10,000 investment that the publisher put in you, right? Because they are taking a risk. Every time a publisher signs a new writer, they are taking a risk on that new writer. And folks, I got to tell you that most books are not, breakout successes, right? The reality is, at least in the science fiction world, that most publishers have one or two, maybe as many as 5 writers who really keep the lights on. And it's those writers who pay the office rent, they pay the salaries for your employees, and they allow you to fund less popular books, right? It's become popular in the last couple of years for writers to say, well, hey, why does George Martin get all the shelf space and I get, this much, right? That's not fair. But the reality is that George Martin sells more books because he's more famous, he's more popular, he is more beloved. And those sales allow not just his publisher to take risks on new writers like me, right? But allows booksellers to keep the lights on so they can sell books by writers like me at the relative bottom of the totem pole. And so all of these publishers rely on these sort of big whales to fund especially the more experimental stuff, but to fund new stuff in general, right? Because the reality is that most of these new writers they may earn out their advance, but they may not. They may sell 200 copies and then disappear. I've heard stories about about publishers who put in $1 million investments to sell a couple hundred copies. Sometimes things just bomb. And it is really a game of high stakes gambling, as many business ventures are. And so writers need to understand that publishers are footing almost all of the risk. The only risk that we are really footing as writers in traditional publishing is the risk that if our book doesn't do well, they won't buy another one from you, right? They won't publish another one, which is, of course, a big risk for your long-term dreams, aspirations, and your career. But you may go then and find another career. You certainly shouldn't have quit your day job just because you sold one book, right? You definitely, even if you get one of those rare, giant advances up front, which will almost never happen, by the way, in science fiction and fantasy. This is not like, celebrity, political publishing. You are not an ex-president writing your memoir. You're not getting, several $1 million in, up front. You might get, 10 grand, right? Maybe 20. Most advances are going to be lower 5 figures in sci-fi and fantasy. They may even be lower than that. And there are publishers as well that don't do advances, but their trade-off may be that instead of a 10% royalty rate, which is fairly standard, they might do, 25 or 35. I think 35 is the highest I've seen. And that means you make more per copy, which is awesome. That's actually a better long-term deal, right? But it's rough on the short term because you need money now, right? Especially if that's your only job. Nevertheless, these advances are sort of the cornerstone upon which I and many other traditionally published writers make our money, right? Because every time we sell a new book, right, or sign a new contract, to be very technical, because it's the signing of the contract that really, really matters, we are injecting, more money into our lives and being able to keep our lives going and our careers going. And so you may sign a contract just for one book, right? And that contract may have the option to look at, the next thing you've got. For instance, you sign a contract and they say, well, you want to write this series, make sure the first book stands alone, but we'll bake into the contract that we have the first right to look at whatever your second book is, right? Which will usually, at least in fantasy and science fiction, be the sequel to the first one, right? Now, you may get a contract that buys 3 books, right? In which case you're locked in for those 3. Congratulations. You know where your money's coming from for the next couple of years, which is great. So you as a writer want to pursue some multi-book contracts so that you've got some stability, right? You may talk to multiple publishers, right? If you're one of those writers who can produce material very quickly, right? Can write multiple books a year. Maybe they aren't, say, this long. You can write more books. You can sign more contracts. You can get more money because usually these advances are going to be paid out in installments. You'll get a chunk when you sign the contract. You'll get a chunk when you deliver the finished manuscript. You'll get a chunk when the book comes out. Right. And that may be split up to, you may get some, say, when the first edition comes out, whether that's hardcover or trade paperback. Right. And then you'll get one whenever the second one comes out, if that's trade paperback, if that's mass market, whatever. And so you'll get these sort of installments broken up. Let's say it's a $20,000 advance. You may get $5,000 when you sign that contract. You may get $5,000 when you deliver the manuscript to the publisher, $5,000 with the hardcover, $5,000 with the paperback. And that's split up so that these advances can, as closely as publishing is able to, simulate the more regular payouts of a salary, right? Now, you're never going to get paid weekly in publishing. You've got to, keep track of your finances a little bit more carefully than if you are getting paid every Friday, right? But the reason they break this up is so that, you've got $5,000 maybe that's coming in February, and then, you'll deliver the manuscript around June, right? You've got another $5,000 there. Now, you'll notice that this is not enough money to live on. In most parts of the country, you cannot go 3 months on $5,000. That's very, very hard to do. That is not and so this is one of the reasons it's very hard for writers to do this full time, right? It's very nice supplemental income. When I was just, getting out of college, the money coming in from my advances helped me, with my student loans, and my job helped cover the day-to-day. And that was a beautiful, wonderful thing. I was very, very fortunate to be in that position. But as I said, if that were my only job, that's no way to make a living. And so there are other ways that you get money as a writer. The big one is additional royalties, right? Say your book, you were given $10,000 in advance. That means that you're not seeing any extra money for that book until you sold 5,000 of those copies at $2 a piece, right? You're seeing no more money, but that does mean that after you sold those 5,000, that you will see money for every copy that you sell. So you sold 10,000 and it continues to sell. Then you may get checks for several $1,000s later on, or several $100s, or, tens of dollars, right? Now you're really rolling in it. You made, $30, right? Because of course, books start to sell less and less over time, with some exceptions. Most books start to attenuate and they drop off the radar, which is why most writers are really behooved by continuing to make new material, because you need those new books to keep selling, because the old ones have sort of dropped off. Either, you've reached sort of market saturation for the kinds of people who are going to read your book, or, you never really got up to steam and found a broader and broader audience, or whatever, right? Like, you need to keep making new material, because the old stuff is, with very few exceptions, not going to stay up. Obviously, books like Dune or Ender's Game are still in, for science fiction, they're still in like the top 10 books sold nationally every single week. The other thing that you need to keep yourself floating then are those royalty payments. Those typically come twice a year, because royalty periods are sort of credited from the 1st of January to the end of June, and from the 1st of July to New Year's Eve, right? And so in addition to your new advances for new material, new books that you're publishing, new stories you may be selling, whatever, right? You got these two payments that come every year, one sometime sort of in April and one sometime in like October, November. And those are going to be the collected royalties per publisher, right? Because if you're with multiple publishers, you'll get one from each, right? I'm just really a one publisher guy as far as my novels are concerned, at least here in the US. We'll get to foreign sales in a minute. And so you'll get these checks right now. If you have 100 books published, right, and there are writers who do have hundreds of books published, that can stack up, right? Because even if you're only making, say, a couple grand a book every 6 months, but you have a lot of books out, that can really, really add up. And so one of the ways that you can be successful in this business, even if you're never a top tier bestseller, is to write a lot of stuff that stays in print. Now, that staying in print is important, because you can write all the books in the world, but if you can't find a publisher for them, and there are no shortage of published authors in the world who cannot get their old books unfrozen, right? They're just dead. If you're in that situation, those books are not making you any money. But if you can keep your backlist, right, your old titles in print, then you can do all right, especially long term. So, and it's nice too, because those are books that you've written, you don't have to work for anymore. That's done. And so you build your annual income not just off of the installments for new advances, new work that's coming out, but you rely on those two royalty checks, or those two royalty periods. There may be multiple checks, because you may have multiple publishers, but you use those to really, really get your your money in, right? And again, if you have a lot of books in print, those can be really big checks. But the big thing, and this is one of those things I think that independent writers overlook, right? Amazon published writers, is foreign sales, particularly translation market. Because when you sell your books, when you sign that contract, or rather when you're negotiating that contract, you are not really selling them the book, right? You obviously retain ownership of the intellectual property. If you ever see a contract that says they are going to buy the intellectual property from you, don't sign it, right? The exception being, of course, if you are going to write for Star Wars, say, right? You're doing a contract with Del Rey for Disney, right? And you're going to write a Star Wars book. There's no way you're going to own Star Wars, right? So you are doing that work for hire, they would say. If you do that, you're not going to own the IP, sorry. But you're still the owner of your IP. The publisher is instead really leasing the rights to print your book in certain forms and under certain conditions. And that may be like, we're going to have print rights in just North America, right? So they've got the English language sales from the US and Canada. They might instead buy world English rights, so they get to print anywhere where English is dominant language, right? The UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, in the broader world English market. English books are sold in places like India and Singapore, really places all over the world. But you might sell those world English rights, or you might retain those world English rights and sell to a US publisher, and then again to, say, a British publisher, or vice versa, and get multiple sales that way. And that means that you've effectively just doubled the amount of advance money you have coming in, right? Because you've got a sale here in the US, you've signed a contract here in the US, you've done the same in the UK, and you may be getting more money spread out. Ditto as well with translations. And this is really one of the places where having an agent is indispensable, in my opinion, right? A lot of writers, again, particularly independent writers, Amazon writers, are going to say you don't really need an agent. And that's true, right? Like, there are ways to be very successful in publishing without an agent. There's ways to be very successful in publishing without a publisher, right? Obviously, Michael Sullivan does very, very well by himself, and better than me. But that doesn't mean that the old way of doing things is completely outmoded. And translations and foreign sales are really where that shines, right? Because every time you resell your book, right, and this is a book you've already written, you're not doing any more work, right, to, say, the French market or the German market or the Russian market or wherever, right? China, Japan, Arabia is starting to really get into sci-fi and fantasy, which is kind of cool, right? All sorts of places around the world, South America, wherever, you are bringing in more money. So those foreign sales really help you as a writer to stand financially on your own 2 feet. So that's where a good agent really comes in, because you don't have the time or the know-how, right, or the connections to go and sell a book in Serbia or wherever, right? Because you may not speak those languages, right? And even if you did, you might not know what the publishing scene there looks like. And that, again, is where agents I found are really indispensable. And getting an agent is something I should probably do a video about at some point. But this is more of a general interest thing. But those foreign sales really help you to multiply the amount of money that you make off a single title, right? And once you've done that, half a dozen times, then maybe the amount of money you're making off a new book is sufficient to live off of in at least some parts of the country on its own. Now, again, the space between there and, look, I'm just trying to sell this thing I wrote that's in a trunk under my bed is large. I recognize that that's a large space, and I'm not trying to say this is like a beginner's guide to surviving. As a writer, I just wanted to explain sort of how this works. So those foreign sales, though, really do help make that possible, as do audio sales, right? Because you may sell your rights to the audiobook to your publisher initially, but you can also retain those and sell them separately, right? Sometimes, for example, you sell them with your North American English rights to a publisher, and your publisher may turn around then and sell the audio rights to an audiobook producer, and then they'll make some money off of that, which will then come back to you. And authors do make money off the sales of audiobooks, copy for copy. We make money when you guys check books out at libraries. There is not a bad way for you as a reader to read a book except stealing it. Obviously, stealing anything is wrong. You know, although I would download a car if I could, you know, the old piracy ads. That sounds cool. But and I guess in the age of 3D printing, you can, in fact, download a car. So it's not as silly as it was in 1998. There's not a bad way to read, right? Going to the library is amazing. Borrowing the book from your friend or loaning a book to your friend is great, right? Because the important thing, and this is where I think a lot of even very well-established writers are a bit blind, I think. What writers need is not book sales in a long-term sense. What writers need is readers, right? Because even a reader who borrows the book at a library or gets it from his friend or his brother may not have been, or her brother, even a reader who does not pay for the book themselves may talk about it, right? May convince their friends to go get it. Nothing, there is no bad press, right? Even bad reviews will get people to read your book sometimes, right? And so there's not a bad way to do it. You should never feel bad about borrowing the book from a friend and never paying for it, right? Because you're probably still going to tell at least one person, hey, I read this book and I liked it. You may also not like it, right? And that still could go on to encourage someone else to take a look at it. And so all of that's great, right? And I see a lot of writers who get upset about things like that. And I know publishers that get upset about things like that. And I don't think that that's a problem at all, because readers are what make a writer's career possible, not book sales. Book sales are one-time events, right? Readers, if you do your job right, stick around forever. And that is, of course, what I love about each and every one of you. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, stay well.